Hello, friends. Welcome to the sort of first video that we're doing for our Formation for All class on ethics, sin and righteousness. I think we're going to get to do all that stuff and talk about all of those things. We're getting ready for our first class. We're doing our classes a little bit differently with this course. In the sense that we are not going to do it as kind of a lecture with some time for responses and things like that. What we're going to try to do is to offer some of that kind of teaching and that kind of work outside of our typical class sessions, and to also have you as participants be prepared for the course by doing your own work ahead of time and then coming in and being prepared to discuss it. So this video is really an introduction to the first sort of assignment, to the first book that we're going to look at, and to tell you what I'd like you to do between now and when we meet. With this video, you'll also receive a PDF of a book by Oliver Thompson. The PDF, the book is called A History of Sin. I'll do the reading rainbow thing here if you like that. A History of Sin by Oliver Thompson. This is what we're starting with. Because there's the introductory chapter is on the nature of moralities. We'll talk later about the differences perhaps between ethics and morality, the difference between ethics, sin, and righteousness, those kinds of things. But I want us, for right now, to kind of hold all of those in close proximity to one another, and to be thinking about how they're related to one another and how they interact. The particular assignment that we have for next week is to read this opening chapter as carefully as you can, given the time between now and then. And I'm going to tell you why we're starting with this. I think it's helpful to kind of talk about how this book is situated. Books always come from somewhere. Works on ethics, on anything for that matter, comes from somewhere. And I think it's helpful to talk about where things come from. The author of this work, Oliver Thompson, is an independent scholar who was educated at Cambridge, who taught at Trinity College in Cambridge, and who also taught at the University of Glasgow, which is where I did some of my academic work, for all the good that does to know that. But it does mean that he did his work. He holds a PhD in history, and that tells us something about where this book comes from. He's not a theologian. He's not even an ethicist, somebody who's necessarily concerned about the idea of morality and ethics at the sense that he's wanting to tell us what to do and think. He's not concerned about those kinds of issues. He's concerned with how ethical, moral ideas show up in different times and in different places and across different cultures. And so what that means is that this opening chapter can feel kind of it's a broad spectrum of views, ideas, practices, habits, different ways that different peoples looked at and thought about the same subject. How somebody understands sexuality, marriage, and the family, those kinds of things, is not, in his telling, dependent upon there being a single ethical norm that those things stem from. Rather, what he's talking about is how different places and times have viewed that in different ways. Pay particular attention as you're reading this to how Christianity understood the same idea in different ways across time, culture, and place. It's one of the themes of this chapter. It's going to be one of the themes of this course. That's an important thing to kind of have in mind from the beginning, is that the idea of ethics is something that is changeable. The other thing about this book that I think is worth looking at is the focus is not on, say, universal ethics, universal ways of thinking about ethics. The focus is on how people have understood and practiced ideas about sin, about morality, about good living, and about ethics. So it's a human work. The idea is that regardless of what these humans may have thought God or whatever authority they're deriving their ethics from, regardless of what they thought God might be telling them to do, this is what their actual practice is. And then in some instances he talks about why that practice or that understanding is different. So we're starting with this text because it's a text about people. It's about how humanity has understood or maybe misunderstood the nature of what we in the church might call sin and righteousness, about what qualifies as wrongdoing and what qualifies about doing good. So we're beginning with this idea that ethics is something that is changeable, with the idea that ethics is something that is always situated. That is, it's always situated in a particular place, in a particular time, from a particular standpoint, background, and that is going to change based on a tremendous number of things. Gender, race, religion, where we are geographically, all of these things change and influence our understanding of ethics. And on that point, as you're reading, try and pay attention to the ethics of the author. He doesn't exactly come out and say what his ethical positions are or what his particular beliefs are on certain things, but there are points where he's very clear in saying that certain things are evil. Particularly in reference, say, to the Nazi Party of the 1930s, or to similarly horrific historic practices and events. That he doesn't leave any ambiguity about the rightness and the wrongness of that. There are other issues that he seems to take a more ambiguous stance on. Particularly, say, in relation to human sexuality, to ways in which humanity deems it right or immoral, say, to kill other people. Those are things that are contested. And on those points, pay attention to how he talks about them. Think about how you hold those ideas and why. Think about why you disagree with what he's saying and why you might agree with what he's saying. We're not reading this because I think that this is a particularly good work. I really kind of don't. I don't think he's necessarily correct in his judgment. But I do think that he covers a lot of ground in a compelling way, and he gets the big picture points. He at least names them for us. And so that means that there's going to be plenty for us to talk about. And on that note, as we're preparing for Wednesday night's class, I want us to do two things as we read. And I'll put this in the email so you'll have it in front of you in written form as well. The two things are this. The first one is, this book is over 30 years old. It was written in 1993. And so I want us to think about our own personal ethics as they change, as they exist over time. Think about how you understood some of the issues that he raises in 1993. Think about where you were in your life, in where you were living, what your religious affiliations were, who was in your circle the people who shaped and influenced your morality at that time. And this is going to be a much more useful exercise if you pick a topic that you've changed your mind about. So in 1993, I was still in high school. I was part of and associated with a fairly, not a fairly conservative, a religious tradition that was becoming deeply conservative and regressive at numerous points. And so the way that he talks about issues of human sexuality are things that I would have held a very narrow view of in 1993, and it would have been a view that would have been based on teachings coming out of my church, the people around me at that time, the particular way in which they were reading the Bible, and then some of the authors and the influential voices that surrounded us. So there was a lot of work that people offered, say, from Focus on the Family and James Dobson and things like that. So if I was doing the assignment, I would say, well, this is where I was in 1993. This is what I thought then. And the process by which I changed my mind about these issues followed these paths. Okay? So be thinking about that. And like I said, try to find something that you've actually changed your mind on. It's not really a helpful exercise to read this and say, well, I've never really cared for genocide. Okay? I mean, hopefully that's something that, kind of sits with you, all the way through, right? The idea of murder has never really appealed to me. Okay, that's good, but that's not going to be particularly helpful for this assignment. So pick something that he talks about in this book, and describe how you understood it 30 years ago, and then how it changed for you, how that change came about. And that's going to be part of our conversation when we gather. The other thing that I want you to do as you're reading, and this is the second part of this assignment, pay attention to the categories that he creates to discuss the moralities that he is describing. He identifies 10 different categories that he uses to describe where morality comes from, what motivates morality, what the fundamental categories of moral concern are, how morality is developed, and how it changes. Okay? That's, kind of an outline what he's kind of doing there. It may be helpful for you to write some of those things down and to outline it or to highlight it as you're reading this, as you're reading through this PDF. And so that way you can keep track of it. And he does it in a very nice way. First I think this, second there's this, third there's that. Okay? So he spells it out for you pretty clearly. As you're making note of those things, write down what you think is helpful about it, what is unhelpful. And when I'm talking about helpful and unhelpful, what is it that, as he writes, that you think that catches your attention? And you say, I haven't thought about that. And that's a really interesting way to think about morality. And that can be like big categories, like the idea that our morality comes from somewhere. And these are the people, the places, the influences on that. Write down what you agree with, that you think he's really got it figured out. Write down the things that you disagree with, either in the big categories or in, particular points. There's stuff that he says that I don't think he's got right. And there's stuff that has changed wildly over the last 30 years, that have changed culturally over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, the cultural acceptance of homosexuality within the United States was really quite limited, particularly in comparison to where it is today. It's before you had someone like Ellen DeGeneres, who publicly comes out as a platformed person, right? And normalizes that. It's before it was legal for people to be married. Think about those kinds of issues and things. and write down the questions that you have about that, about what his understanding raises for you and how you want to engage with that. I suggested that you write it down. I would very much like you to do that. It doesn't have to be a formal paper in any sense of the word. It can be, little notes, outlines. Sometimes I think it's helpful to write down a sentence or two, maybe a paragraph, if that helps to organize your thoughts. And the reason I want you to write it down is because the act of physically sitting and writing out our thoughts helps us to reinforce our learning and to engage with a given text. And it's also going to be helpful for your preparation for our class participation, because it's easier to look down at your notes and say, I was thinking about this, than it is to try to remember and flip back and forth, and say where this comes from. As you're doing that, it's also going to be good if you can write down whatever the page number is that it's on, and that'll be a service to your classmates. So you can say, well, on page 17 he says this, and these are my thoughts on it. Okay, so those are the two assignments that I'd like you to do. Now, I need to say a word about this text. This is not what I would call particularly good academic writing. It's written at at kind of a popular level. He's covering a lot of ground. Millennia in some cases. If you start reading the actual book, he starts at like 3000 BC or something like that. There's 5,000 years of history that he covers in 220 pages of work. That tells you that it's kind of an airplane, the view from 30,000 feet. Okay? And the other thing that isn't so much the problematic part of this, as the fact that there are places where he just mentions people in passing. So he'll reference Spinoza, for example. And you sort of have to know who that guy was. And I'm assuming that probably most of us don't. I have some limited acquaintance with him. He was a 17th century Jewish philosopher who developed some radical ideas about the nature of God and religion. And he's someone who's much better appreciated today than he really was in his own time. And the way that he kind of uses him is he says, well, Spinoza thought this. And then you get maybe a sentence about what this guy thinks. And if you don't know who it is or what this person is or what he's referring to, that can be kind of confusing. And so what I want you to do is to kind of read this lightly. You don't need to know who Baruch Spinoza was in order to understand the gist of Thompson's argument. Or you don't have to know all of the other cultural references and things that he talks about, because he talks about things that happen in, say, the 7th century in China or something, and I'm not familiar with that. I know enough about the references that he makes to European and Christian history to say that generally the way he characterizes these things is generally accurate, but it doesn't tell us the specifics about it. And so when you bump into something and you say, I don't have any idea what that is, just skip on to the next paragraph. Soon enough, he's going to be talking about Nazis again, and then you know who they are. Okay, that's the idea. There is a lot of stuff here, and when there's so much stuff, it's easy to kind of get lost in the details. It's accurate enough for what we're trying to do with it, and I don't want you to get hung up on those things. So I'm giving you permission to try to read it for the big picture without worrying about the small stuff. All right, so that's the assignment. That's the introduction to this. I hope it goes well, and I'm looking forward to our conversation when we meet.